Chapter 21, the lymphatic system, screencast 1. Chapter 21 will be subdivided into two screencasts, and the first screencast is focusing primarily on the vascular side of the lymphatic system. So we'll be looking at lymph and the vessels that carry lymph. The two functions that are primarily associated with the lymphatic system are to return excess fluid. Remember that at the venule end of the capillary, not all fluid is reabsorbed. So the lymphatic system actually serves as a very important way of picking up this fluid that was not reabsorbed and getting it back into circulation. So fluid balance is a really critical function associated with the lymphatic system. The other function is going to be an immune component. And one of the factors that is going to happen with respect to the immune system is lymphocytes will be housed and transported through the lymphatic system. And also there'll be some other immune cells that do play a role that can be found in the lymphatic system. When we look at what makes up the lymphatic system, we'll be looking at lymph vessels, lymphoid tissues, organs, and lymph itself, which is the fluid that is transported within the lymphatic vessels. Now, keep in mind the characteristics of lymph. It's interstitial fluid. We've already addressed that some of the fluid that is leaving the capillary is not reabsorbed, and the lymph is how the lymphatic system and these vessels are how we're going to reclaim this fluid and get it back into circulation. So this interstitial fluid will move into these capillaries, and once it is in those capillaries, it's now going to be called lymph. This is a very common trend that we'll encounter throughout the rest of the semester, where the contents of a tube or organ quite often will change depending upon where it moves to, and so on. Now, lymph is interstitial fluid, so what we can expect to find making up lymph is going to be water, solutes that have been dissolved, maybe some small amount of proteins, and these will be very small proteins. But other things that may potentially be found in lymph would be debris. That could be from trauma, and the body's just kind of cleaning up an area of injury. It could be specific pathogens, or unfortunately, it is one way in which cancer cells actually make their way to other parts of the body. Now, the image that we're looking at here is probably one of the best images I've ever seen, really indicating the relationship between lymphatic capillaries and our regular capillaries. Now, these capillaries are a little different than blood capillaries. They're slightly larger. They're not going to have a basement membrane, and they're also small, and they're closed-ended vessels, so that makes them different. Another structural component is the walls are made of these overlapping endothelial cells. So these flaps between these cells, fluid can enter, but it can't exit what sits in there. Another characteristic of these lymphatic capillaries are these anchoring filaments, and these actually are holding the endothelial cells to nearby structures. Now, another example of a lymphatic vessel that we'll address later is when we are studying the digestive system, the small intestine in particular, we'll talk about lacteal. And this is a lymphatic capillary that is responsible for absorbing lipid-soluble substances such as fat-soluble vitamins, cholesterol, and other lipid products from the GI tract. Now, the driving force for lymph to move it into the lymphatic capillaries and throughout the lymphatic vascular system is a hydrostatic pressure of the interstitial fluid as it's pushed into the capillary. Now, the pressure of this lymph, because now we're inside of a tube, it's going to exert force, and these intercellular openings, or these flaps of the capillary wall, they're going to close, and that keeps the lymph on the inside. Then we'll actually look at the lymph moving through vessels of larger and larger, just like we saw in the systemic venous side of things. Now, when we look at the vessels, they are in this particular order from smallest to largest. We start off with the lymphatic capillaries, then we'll have lymphatic vessels, lymphatic trunks, and the largest of the vessels will be lymphatic ducts. Ultimately, we're actually going to see this fluid put back into circulation. Now, one thing that we may have heard of previously is this term metastasis. And this is specifically related to how cancer can spread to other parts of the body. So basically, you have these cancer cells and they make their way through the lymphatic system, and they actually will start or form a secondary tumor. So the process of this happening is metastasis. For example, there are a number of cancers such as breast cancer. It may actually metastasize to the lung. Lung cancer quite often metastasizes or makes its way to the brain. So basically, these cancerous cells are broken free from the primary tumor, and they're just going to move to other areas of the body and transported within the lymph. Now, when we look at the lymphatic vessels, now we're focusing on the larger vessels, trunks, and ducts, and these are actually fed by lymphatic capillaries. They are going to be located right to arteries and veins, and these lymphatic vessels will have all three tunics. They'll have the intima, the media, and the externa, just like veins. They also will have valves because this is a low-pressure system, and these valves are going to prevent pooling and the backward flow of lymph. Now, since the lymphatic system does not have a pump, it's going to move lymph using mechanisms that we talked about previously with venous return. Well, there will be a skeletal muscle and respiratory pump. We'll also look at the pulsatile movement of nearby arteries. Also, we'll see this rhythmic contraction of smooth muscle in the larger lymph vessel walls. And some vessels, eventually they're going to make their way to lymph nodes, and in those particular areas, that is where the filtration of lymph is going to take place. Now, trunks are fed by lymphatic vessels. I'm not going to put a significant emphasis on the trunks. You're not responsible for the areas that they drain. But for the sake of covering it, the trunks are as follows: the jugular trunk, subclavian trunk, bronchomediastinal trunk, intestinal trunk, and lumbar trunk. So these are all the trunks that we find, and they are larger vessels. And eventually, these vessels will feed into ducts. And the ducts are the largest, and there's two of them. These are the lymphatic vessels that are actually going to put lymph back into circulation. There are two of these ducts. One is the right lymphatic duct, and the other is the thoracic duct. The right lymphatic duct is right by the right clavicle, and it is only responsible for draining the upper right quadrant of the body. So it basically will take lymph from those areas of the body, and it's going to basically drain into the junction of the right subclavian and right internal jugular veins. Now, the other duct is going to be the thoracic duct. This is the largest lymphatic vessel. And if we look at the diagram here, we're basically looking at the areas that are actually drained by the two ducts. We can see that the right upper quadrant is drained by the right lymphatic duct, and everything else is going to be drained by the thoracic duct. And so this thoracic duct is going to run from the diaphragm to junction of the left subclavian vein and left jugular veins, and that's how that fluid will actually make its way back into circulation. Now, at the base, there's a structure known as the cisterna chyli, and this is actually receiving really, really lipid-rich chyle from the GI system. We'll also look at draining the lymph from the left side of the head and neck, left upper limb, left side of thorax, abdomen, and both lower limbs. So we are looking at a significantly larger structure than the right lymphatic duct. Here we can basically see a better view of the ducts. We can actually see the right lymphatic duct, and notice it's not very big here, okay? And now let's take a look at the thoracic duct, and see how big it is compared to the right lymphatic duct. And also we can see as it goes through the diaphragm, there's the base of the thoracic duct, and there's that cisterna chyli. Now, a condition that quite often is associated with lymph could be lymphedema. This is an accumulation of fluid in the interstitial fluid because there's interference or an issue with the drainage in the lymphatic system. It could be a blockage. That's probably one of the most common causes. There'll be problems with wound healing. There's a likelihood that this could potentially lead to an infection. But generally, we see blockages as the primary cause of lymphedema. So there could be trauma, infection, or tumors. It's not uncommon where treatments for cancer, such as radiation therapy, could be surgical removal of lymph nodes. These are all things that can actually create lymphedema. And generally, it can be managed with compression garments, such as compression socks, etc., exercise, and massage. Now, there is a condition known as elephantiasis, and this is actually caused by infection with parasitic worms.